looking to free your mind? Well, talking about media freedom is a fantastic place to start, and you have just tuned into Free Media, Free Minds here on Cape Town TV. And it is a Sunday night, which does mean that it's a Sunday night about traditional media as a tool for democratization and activism. So joining me here in studio is Mark Weinberg from R2K, which is a non-profit South African organization that aims to reduce state secrecy in the drafting of laws and increase access to information. And joining us is also Alex Dyers, a media activist himself. Good evening, guys. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
Cool. All right, so we'll get to know our guests in a little bit, but before we get into that, we will have a quick look at an insert just to give us some context for the conversation.
Difficulties in terms of remaining afloat, making money. As you know, media are businesses, fine, but they are also very important institutions of politics, culture, education, entertainment, etc., etc. And that is why they are, in most democracies, accorded specific constitutional protections. Like in this country, you've got the Section 16 of the Bill of Rights, which is very specific to the media and also, of course, freedom of expression. So that is sort of the challenge that South African media is going through. Vince does an annual sort of a report called State of the Newsroom. Over the past 5 years, the reports have been quite sad. Decline, but also disruptions. So we've witnessed the sort of social media platforms, social media uptake rather, increasing in South Africa, which is a good thing.
Absolutely about, it's profit-driven, quite a sort of reckless regard for journalistic ethics. And you can imagine working in that space, journalists would come under all sorts of pressures. And I think you, to some extent at least, see it in the headlines. You see it in the writing of Tiso Black Star publications. I mean, often we'll have, screaming headlines, some, of course, as we well know, some very serious editorial mistakes, and very serious shortfalls. The SARS rogue unit, etc. And despite all the sort of navel-gazing, all the attempts to rectify that and to self-correct, we still see a lot of we see a sort of trend where you will have these screaming headlines, articles that are far from bulletproof, that fall short in many ways, and then attempts afterwards to correct the problem and to apologize and fix things after the fact.
It doesn't mean Professor Turok gets to tell me how to do a story. Or if the facts takes me to Professor Turok's corruption, that I'm going to look the other way. Chances are that I'm probably going to understand it better because I understand the worldview that he comes from. And that's the distinction that we can't make. And our discourse around journalism is simply not entertaining that. And I think that is really important. There are two major institutions that we don't pay enough attention to in this country. The one is the SABC, and it is the largest news organization on the continent with the biggest footprint. If you talk numbers, if you talk Ukhozi, you're talking about 10 million listeners. If you talk Mhlobo Wenene, which is the Xhosa radio station, you're talking about millions of people. It is the only institution that broadcasts in the various languages, including the SAM. And we don't look at what happens on those radio stations. We are obsessed with what happens on the English language stations. We don't quality control the fact that an MEC can literally sit for 20 minutes on Tobela FM and speak and pay the producer of the program on the side. But we are interested in what happens on the English language station. That's probably watched by, a quarter of the audience of Tobela. So our concentration is wrong. Then there's multi-choice. Now here's an interesting thing. Multi-choice digitized the ANC's archives for free. At the same time, they were busy with buying the archives of the public broadcaster for next to nothing. And that was the deal that was ruled by the Competitions Tribunal to be a merger rather than an acquisition. Yunus Karim, a former communications minister, essentially called out Chris Becker and said, you were involved in removing me from office because I was going to stop you from maintaining your monopoly over paid television. We're not talking about that because these are big institutions and they dominate our media landscape. And I think we need to begin to look at what the interests are. If Faith Mutambi could ignore a cabinet decision, a policy decision of the governing party, to suit private capital who happens to be in the media business.
So now that we've had a look at the insert, just to contextualize the conversation, let's get to know our guests a little bit. Like I said, welcome to the show. We are going to have quite an in-depth discussion this afternoon or this evening. So first of all, is it because this is a two-part series, the first part having looked at social media, now we're looking at traditional media, is it a fair comparison to make? If we're going to look at the two, when we size up the two, is it fair to size up social media up against traditional media when we ask which is more effective for activism?
I mean, I definitely think it's not fair at all, especially if you frame it that way. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the two types of media exist in different realms almost. So like traditional media was born in the physical realm. So that would be like radio broadcast, like newspapers, like writing, printing. And then I guess you could also add television broadcast, but like maybe more specifically like state-owned public broadcast. That's like traditional, but it's all like physical things that you must build, and that to generate the content is like a physical process. Whereas like social media comes in this new age of the digital revolution. So it is built off of the internet, and that is in the digital realm. So yes, it does have a physical part. You gotta have towers, all of that,
computers,
whatever, cell phone, or physical typing. But it's just to say, like, the way the media information is being shared is at this hyper-fast digital experience. And traditional media, if nothing else, there's many things that it kind of lacks when you compare it, but things where it also does better. The main thing, especially for activism, is quicker. And activism is now, it's quicker. Can't wait to print. Tweet. Klar.
I think it's interesting to compare the two because you can learn a lot about both. Traditional media is what they call a broadcast model, one voice, an editor, with a very passive audience receiving information. In the digital age, the audience is also involved in the production. On the other hand, in the traditional media model, journalism is professionalized.
Yes.
There are ethics, there's resources for research, for investigations, etc. In the digital age, anyone can say any crazy thing. You know, in the early days, we used to say the internet was a much freer space for activists because you could set up your own website, your own blog, and so on. Whereas the mass media has got very high barriers to entry. You have to be extremely wealthy to own a radio station, TV station, printing press. We used to say you could get into the internet easily. All of us can have a website. What we're seeing increasingly, though, is really the shutting down of the internet. It's becoming more and more curated, more and more controlled by large corporations like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and they're using algorithms to curate. So they're saving a lot of money. We're doing the work for them by producing the content. But they're actually becoming more and more aggressive in editorializing and deciding how big your audience can be, even kicking you off their platforms if you say things that challenge the status quo.
So Mark, you mentioned that you need to have a lot of money to own a traditional media outlet of in whatever way that it looks. So does the media serve and give information that the public needs to know, or so that we can engage more with the political process, or are we really just pushing profits?
Yeah, that's like a loaded question, because when I look at that, you're using one word, media, and well, traditional media. But I look at that in two different ways. I look at that in terms of the ideal, and I look at it in terms of the reality. So those to me are very different things. So in the reality, I can emphatically say no, it's not. Especially when we say like traditional media, institutional media, like the formal journalistic, all of them. You can name any name, I don't know, I don't care which name, all of them are driven by the profit incentive. Just like facts, end of the day facts, you know? So that means certain things. That means that the highest priority is making money, not giving relevant, true information. And it's not to say you can't have a bias and an ideology and an agenda, because you can't not have that. But there are some who will say that we are free and open when it's clear that you're not. And actually nobody can be trying to say we're free and open because you're all trying to make money. And so there's a violence that happens when you do that. So the ideal would do what we think the media, I'm going to read the newspaper, okay, what's going on? Okay, cool, that's what's going on. No, that's not what's going on. This newspaper right there is not what's going on. There's other things going on.
What's going on? Mark, what can you say?
No, I mean, I think all media, any media, is better than no media. So even if it's controlled by commercial interests, even if it's controlled by state interests, it's any free flow of information, any flow is better than no flow. There's a very funny story from the 1980s. There was a funeral in the Eastern Cape of an activist, and the underground Communist Party attended the funeral with a big red banner, hammer and sickle. And that night, the apartheid state broadcaster, the SABC, reported on the funeral, and the voiceover was saying, you know, Roy Gevaar, the communists are coming. The next day, Soweto was on fire. Why? Because Roy Gevaar, the communists are coming. So it had the opposite intention of what the censors were hoping. It actually transmitted the activists in the Eastern Cape around the country. So at the very minimum, any media is better than no media. Of course, who owns it has a lot of control over the agenda, who works there has a lot of control over the agenda. And we fight for media diversity because we want you to get many different points of view so that you can compare them and figure out for yourself what's the most plausible reality.
You mentioned that media ownership influences the agenda that's pushed in what's being broadcasted. So would you say, quickly before we go to an ad break, that media is staged?
Yeah.
Or rather that democracy is staged in the media?
Yeah, it's all a performance, it's all theater. So a lot of my thinking is informed by this guy, Augusto Boal, from South America. With this book, Theatre of the Oppressed. He was friends with Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And his basic thesis, Boal, is that all life, human life, is inherently political. Which is to say, political, who gets what, when, and where, and how. How do we engage? How do we interact? This thing of parliament is not politics, or it's not only politics. You will watch that and talk about it in those terms, EFFDA, what. That's not all politics. That is a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of politics. How I got here today is politics.
All right, Alex, we're going to get into this a little bit more straight after the break. Welcome back to it. This is Free Media, Free Minds, and I am your host, Chelsea Noah Ogilvie, and we are speaking traditional media as a form or as a tool for democratization and activism with Mark and Alex. So before the break, we did speak about democracy as, or rather democracy being formed, or rather being staged in media. So Mark, where do you stand on this?
I think it's very cynical to say everything is kind of manipulated. People enter the public sphere and the media with very different agendas. Yes, the media owners have got political interests. Ultimately, they want to be sustainable or make a profit. But journalists have their own agendas. Journalists are often very independently minded, curious people. They get drawn to that profession. The sources, the guests, come with their agendas. So it's actually a very contested space, but it relies, the audience has to do a lot of work. to figure out what the different agendas are and to decide what to believe and where they stand.
But I think it's also easier for audiences to just believe what they read. I think in a utopia we would have audiences that critically engage with the content that they read, but most of the time I think the public kind of just takes it as the truth.
Yeah, but take a newspaper article. Yes, there's an editor appointed by an owner that decides the angle that the story is relevant at all, but then there is the journalist who actually goes and interviews people and brings their take on the story. And then there's an army of government spin doctors, corporate spin doctors, all trying to push their own agenda in that same article. So it does require some media literacy to understand all the different pressures that produce that article and to be able to make sense of it. It's not all just crude propaganda. It's not all just one-dimensional, and it can't be dismissed. You have to be able to read between the lines and take the information that's been verified to inform yourself as a citizen.
Okay, so if we look at diversity and freedom of the media, what in your view, both of your views, has contributed to diversity and freedom of media? Do we have a free media at all?
For me, it depends how you're defining the media, because I kind of distinguish between two broad types, and then inside there you subdivide. But you would have like industry, traditional media, and then what I would consider like community media, which is like what we're doing here today. So those feel like very different spaces to me, even though on a surface level you're doing very much a similar thing. But for me, the key is the process, because a lot of my learning, I was first taught the traditional way, which is all that matters is the outcome. And the outcome is the profit incentive ultimately, more than it is a good product. Versus this community way, which is to say that the process is as important as the outcome. Because here, in the community way, we are teaching each other. We're learning together, and it's not like this intense hierarchy thing, though there is a hierarchy. It's a lot more flat, a lot more open, a lot more distributed, a lot more voices. Yes, there's a little bit more chaos in a way, but that chaos is necessary energy, you know? So that media, I would say, is a lot more free than like the traditional SABC industry media.
We'll get into that.
Yeah, I think under the kind of conservative mainstream definition, we have to be very clear that the South African media is free. There's no formal government censorship. We've got some of the best laws in the world when it comes to protecting journalists, protecting sources, and so on. But on the other hand, under capitalism, are any of us free? Bills have to be paid, compromises have to be made, the bosses have more power than the workers. So I agree with you that community media is trying to democratize, trying to push the boundaries to make a freer media, a media that's more open to people and more about people. But even community media is hustling to pay the bills and has to make all kinds of compromises to get that done.
In this capitalist system that we're trying to broadcast in, do we need to transform the media at all? And with that being said, what do we transform it into?
I would say it's naturally being transformed, and this happens as we introduce like new age media into the conversation. Because sure, today we are discussing traditional media, but broadly we're discussing media, and this new thing that's entered the world has actually changed the way traditional media operates and functions, because it opens up like this whole other new world, this whole other new way, this whole other just like dimension of experience. And a lot of it is the interactivity, is the fact that, let's say with the marches that have been happening now recently, sure you have your big ENCA cameras, but I have my phone, and then I'll make a video, maybe I know how to edit, so I cut it up, you know, maybe I interviewed some people there, cut it up as well, put it on YouTube, put it on Twitter. Now all of a sudden I'm part of the public conversation. I attach it to a hashtag. Now I've joined like a global conversation, and that was just me in my room.
Yeah.
You know, so that already changes the whole game naturally.
It really depends on what you mean by transformation, because if you're talking about more voices and more diverse voices, then we've seen a very dramatic transformation of the mainstream traditional media far more people of color, far more women at all the different levels. Obviously, with social media, an explosion of voices. But if transformation is about the strength of the voices, I think we're moving in the opposite direction. When we fall in 1993, when Bush Radio went on air as the first community station in South Africa, it gave birth to a vision of a diverse media, which is in our law now. South Africa has to have community media. But it's been set up to fail. It's been set up to hustle and starve and can't do justice to its mandate. So it really becomes spaza shop media. At the bigger, more corporate level, we see these massive consortiums and mergers and fewer people having more and more of a voice in the media. Fewer and fewer journalists, massive retrenchments. So the spin doctors are having a field day. They put out press statements and they read their press statement in the newspaper, virtually unchecked. So there's some very big problems with transformation. Our media is heading in the wrong direction, becoming more homogenous, less critical.
So because we spoke briefly about the SABC. Before we even get to that, do we need the SABC?
No, we don't. Why?
What the?
Mark
who?
disagrees.
For who?
Mark, what do you think?
Listen,
Let's get into this.
let's get into this. And I think we're agreeing that one of the big problems is in the media environment is commercialization, where in order to survive, even Cape Town TV has to sell airtime to donors, to advertisers, to churches, has to be very sensitive about editorial choices so as not to offend people that are bringing in money. We need a media that is outside of the market. We need a publicly funded media, one that accounts to us as taxpayers, because us as taxpayers are funding it. And we all pay tax, right? We all pay VAT on our bread and so on. So we need a taxpayer-funded media. Also in South Africa, you have what is called market failure. A lot of media catering to the urban, English-speaking middle classes. 20, 30 magazines, 3 or 4 daily newspapers. But go into the townships. Go outside the townships into the rural areas. Go into the parts of South Africa where people speak not English, but indigenous languages. And you'll find the grossest inequality in terms of access to the media. The market, the advertisers and the owners can't meet that need. The public has to, and the public broadcaster is critical. All 11 languages, how many radio stations, how many TV stations. It's one of the jewels of our democracy, and it's very sad to see the state it's in now. It's very sad to see this fellow Cyril Ramaphosa and his finance minister pushing hard to destroy the SABC, pushing hard to privatize it. We must be defending the SABC and improving it. Part of improving it is making sure it's properly funded, so it's also not hustling for advertising.
Alex, you disagree?
Yeah, I would say I fundamentally disagree. The main point at which I fundamentally disagree, because you asked a very specific question, do we need the SABC? My fundamental disagreement comes from the fact that I believe in a decentralized media more than I believe in a centralized media, just as a core concept.
Yeah.
So on top of that, you can layer community media versus SABC. So centralized, decentralized. So SABC, I'm not going to get into the problems, but in theory, that concept could function really well. A national broadcaster, publicly funded, checks and balances, good people, not privatized, all of that, quite. Sure, and that could be very nice. However, what I'm a lot more interested in is a decentralized community media, whereby in Bonteheuwel, you are walking on your street, you see something going down, you film that, you plug into this thriving network, which right now does not exist. but I'm an internal optimist, and I believe we have the raw materials. Most of it is our cell phones. We have the knowledge, which is accessible through the internet. We can just connect certain dots. We can create a network where people are making their own news, and they are much closer to it than any SABC person could ever be. However, the true ideal is both of those working together. So then you're feeding each other back and forth.
Yeah.
But then centralized needs to respect decentralized. I feel they do not. That's why I think we don't need SABC.
Yeah. I mean, the SABC still has its feet in the state propaganda model. You hear the stories about politicians calling the newsroom and killing stories or putting things on the air. So I agree with you, we need to look at how we transform the SABC, how we take the massive resources that sit there and better use it. I agree there needs to be more editorial independence for the media workers. And that is part of decentralization, how the SABC can work with community stations to share content in both directions. We need a vibrant SABC, a vibrant and diverse media landscape, which includes the commercial media and the community and the democratic public media, yeah.
Weinberg from R2K, as well as Alex Dyers, a media archivist, chatting to us this evening about media as a tool, or rather traditional media as a tool for activism and transformation. After the break, we will have a chat with Zenzele Ndebele from SITE in Zimbabwe to chat to us, or rather to give us just a more continental context of this conversation. You are still watching Free Media, Free Minds, where we learn, unlearn, and relearn to open up our minds. And in a moment, we'll head to our neighboring country of Zimbabwe to join Zenzele Ndebele at SITE, which is the Center for Innovation and Technology, which is a Zimbabwean NGO. And their mission is to create space for the integration of art and activism for social change. Let's hear what he's got to say. All right, so we are live with Zenzele Ndebele from SITE in Zimbabwe. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. So first and foremost, what does democracy mean to you, and how would you rate democracy in Zimbabwe?
I think for me, democracy is the freedom to express yourself, express your opinions, as well as associate with whoever you want to associate with without any consequences. And I would say in Zimbabwe, I mean, democracy is more like it's a mirage. We talk about it, but it seems very far, because the reality is very different, although we call ourselves the Democratic Republic of Zimbabwe.
All right, so can you maybe comment on the diversity of TV, radio, and just press in general in Zimbabwe?
Well, in terms of TV, we only have one television station in Zimbabwe, which is owned by the state. That is the national broadcaster. That has been the case since 1980. Maybe the background to that, I think you will be interested in knowing that until 2000, the monopoly of the national broadcaster in Zimbabwe was legislated. It was constitutional that the national broadcaster be a monopoly. It was only in 2000 when a group of people called Capital Radio challenged the monopoly of ZBC that it was then struck by the Constitutional Court. But ever since that, there have been basically little effort by the government to actually license independent players. Currently, we have 4 state-owned radio stations, which are the mostly dominate. Then we have about 8 or so private radio stations that are linked to people who are linked to government. And up to now, almost 40 years after independence, Zimbabwe doesn't have any community radio stations.
Well, that's very interesting. So most of your work up until this point has involved exposing the crime against humanity and massacre of the Ndebele people in Zimbabwe in the 1980s. Can you tell us more about this atrocity?
Basically, what happened is that when Zimbabwe got independence in 1980, starting January 20, 1982, there was a genocide in Zimbabwe which was targeting mostly the Ndebele people. During that genocide, over 20,000 people were killed by the National Army. There was a unit of the army which was called Kukurawundi. So it killed a lot of people. A lot of people disappeared, and the painful part is that up to today, the government does not acknowledge that it committed this genocide. They've refused to apologize. They've refused to compensate families. So growing up, I mean, as a young boy, I witnessed this. Growing up, my family has been, all those in the community have been talking about this because at least I know so many people who disappeared, who were killed. And when I became a journalist, I told myself that my mission was to talk about this genocide until we get justice.
Of course. And how has your work been received by the public?
Well, the public has been very receptive. They actually find it knowledgeable. They find at least, it helps them understand because a lot of people don't really know what happened and how it happened. So it has given them that opportunity to learn about their history. But it has not been welcomed by the government, of course, because they don't want people to talk about this. They don't want people to expose what they did almost 36 years ago.
Of course. I mean, I think that the public and government have two different agendas at hand most of the time. So do you think that the media space in Zimbabwe is conducive enough for one to participate or rather to practice their work as journalists?
Well, you just have to navigate the space. There are times when it can be okay to operate, but there are times when you are so much under pressure. So there's really, while the Constitution really, gives that freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, but you always find that being a journalist, you are likely to be a target, you are likely to be arrested. So the working space is not that conducive for anyone who wants to practice journalism.
All right, so with that being said, what laws do hinder or promote the exercise of media professionals?
There are a number of laws in Zimbabwe, basically, that handle the media professionals. The first one, or the most, being the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Bill, is now enacted. So it's the Protection of Privacy Act, which actually says journalists, if you want to practice as a journalist in Zimbabwe, you have to be registered with the Media Council. So you need to have an accreditation card for you to operate, and also gives all sorts of things that you can do, you cannot do. But it also spells out how someone can get information. It makes actually it difficult for you to get information from government sources because it talks about if you want information from a public office, you would have to wait probably for 30 days or so for you to get information. And after 30 days, if you're running a story, it's basically no longer of any interest. But you also have the ZBC, or the Zimbabwe Broadcasting, the Commercialization Act, the Law and Order, Public Order Maintenance Act, which actually says people, not more than 3 people can gather without the clearance of a police. So all these laws affect the operation of the journalists as well as the Official Secrets Act.
So, Zenzele, one of the indicators of democracy is being able to critique the government without fear or favor. Is the media doing enough for this?
Well, you will always criticize the government of Zimbabwe at your own risk because once you criticize the government, you're now targeted. The enemy of the state, the regime change agent, Western funded. So there is no, if you're criticizing the government, you're really not safe. You're doing it, but you know that any time something might happen to you.
All right, so I understand that you yourself have previously ran a community radio station called Radio Dialogue. What was the objective of the station?
Well, Radio Dialogue was one of the first community radio initiatives to set up. The idea was to push for the community radio sector because we were arguing that there's a need for Zimbabwe to implement the 3-tier system where there's the public, the private, and the community media. And the aim was to give the people of Flower a voice because at that particular time there was only the state media which was licensed. That most of the times the state media was concentrated in Harare and in the capital digital, there was nothing basically where community people could, talk about their issues. So the idea of Radio Dialogue was saying radio should be accessible. Community radio is the most important tool when it comes to development because it reaches a number of communities. So the idea was to push for government to actually license community radio stations.
All right, very interesting. Very interesting. And what were the successes and the barriers of the station, of running the station?
Well, the station managed to actually get the community movement going because after a few years, we ended up having the Association of Community Radio Stations, which had more than 14 members. These were community radio initiatives across the country. We started to get government to actually acknowledge that there is need for community radio stations, to start talking about licensing community radio stations. And I think around 2006 and 2010, the Broadcasting Services Act was amended to actually include the community radio sector, although because before that it was never included, although they never went on to license community radio stations. But I believe that the radio station created a lot of buzz, a lot of noise that made government realize that there is need for community radio stations, and they actually acknowledged that community radio stations will need to be licensed one way or the other.
Fantastic. So I feel like the work that you've been doing has definitely had an impact on the country, especially with democracy. So as we begin to wrap up, what is your wish for Zimbabwe's media and democracy?
Well, Zimbabwe needs to have a free media where people can operate. Currently, you have a situation whereby if there are demonstrations, or even there are not demonstrations, journalists are beaten up, journalists are abducted, journalists are arrested, even the ordinary people. Right now, we are talking about, these things when we actually, one doctor has actually disappeared and no one knows what happened to him. So this shows that there is no freedom for expression in Zimbabwe. It shows that the media is not even free to cover such stories. So my wish is that Zimbabwe should respect its constitution. It should allow journalists to operate freely and allow citizens to enjoy their rights that are enshrined in the Constitution of Zimbabwe as well as in the Bill of Rights.
Wow, very interesting chat that we're having here with Zenzele Ndebele from a site in Zimbabwe. Thank you so much for chatting to us, Zenzele.
Thank you.
All right, we look forward to hopefully having you again at some point in the show, in the season.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Have a good one. We'll chat to you soon. Bye. Now that we've heard from Zenzele in Zimbabwe, let's take a bit of a break and go pay the bills. Now this is unfortunately how we begin to wrap up this episode, as we do head into our community notice board up next. That does bring our show to an end this evening. But thank you for joining us, and you can continue the conversation on our social media platforms at freemedia.freeminds on Instagram or Free Media Free Minds on Facebook. So thank you to my guests, Mark from R2K, Alex the media man himself, Zenzela joining us from Zimbabwe. I'm Chelsea Ogilvie. Keep it real, and if it's unreal, keep it anyway.